Hello. So thank you everybody for being here. We're just so pleased to be part of William's book launch. This book has been a long time coming and it's so beautiful to see it realized.
Thank you.
Yeah. We're going to read a couple of poems from the book. We are going to discuss the poems. We're going to talk a little bit about William's sort of approach and philosophy around poetry. And then at the very end, we're going to leave about 10 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So if you think of questions as we're discussing, keep those in mind. You'll have a chance to ask those questions. We're going to start by each reading one poem from Blaze Without Burning, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So, William, why don't you kick it off?
Okay. Through Wilds. What is making me so afraid today? It is a bright day, beautiful. Sunbeams, fluffy white clouds, gentle breezes, idyllic. So why this dread flooding my belly? Why am I wishing only to hide away what will be seen in the light that I wish would stay hidden by darkness? This cannot be the world. It is too unfamiliar, too changed. The distance from the world I know is too far. It cannot be. I will not accept it. Though it does no good, only makes it harder to deal with things as they have become. If you want the truth, I spent the first half of the hike wondering how much longer until we arrived, wherever it was we were going, and the rest wondering when we would get back home.
So I'm going to read the second poem that has this same title, which is called Through Wilds. I am swimming the waters to your shore. No boat came to bring me, but I needed to come even if it meant risking this journey, alone across the waves, with only my will to keep me afloat. Here's where I'd like to start.
Sure.
Is for you to talk a little bit about the unique structure of this book and sort of the shape of the manuscript. What can people expect when they pick up the book to read it?
The book is sort of in two halves, and each half is kind of a mirror image of the other. And the way that's done is there's actually two sets of poems with the same set of titles. And so the first poem and the last poem reflect each other, and so on as you get to the middle. And then there is a little piece in the middle that's sort of a fragment that's sort of the center of the book in a certain way. And so, I kind of think of it as a sculpture garden. There's, to me, a sort of physical journey through the book in a certain sense, or metaphorically at least, where you're going from one element. I think we talked about this a little bit as sort of like the way that a story structure, if you talk about something like the hero's journey, there are certain moments in that journey that are mapped out, and they kind of reflect as you go from the beginning to the end. There's like the call to adventure, and then there's the return to the normal world at the end. So there's that mirroring. The book came together because I was very fortunate to have this other poet, a very talented young lady, who agreed to help me sort of organize some of my poems, and she's sitting here with me. So she's someone who really has an understanding of this. Basically, we had a group of poems that were still unrevised. And that gave me a certain freedom when we were looking at the poems to say, okay, how can I take these poems and put them together into something that is cohesive, that is complete, that's not just one poem and then another poem and then another poem. And as we were working on the book, it sort of organically developed. We were looking at one poem and we were trying to come up with a new title for it, because very often my titles are fairly provisional when I'm writing a draft. And we were looking at it, and I came up with the title, and Frisia was looking at it, and she's like, it's really funny, that title would be really good for this other poem too. And so I was like, well, why can't we use the same title for both of them? And thinking about that idea, the book sort of fell into pairs. Sometimes it feels like when the right idea emerges, you just know immediately and it just happens. Until that moment, the book felt sort of locked up. And once we sort of got that lens, we went from like spending like a week or two, like just trying to figure out how to put the poems together, to suddenly it all just came together immediately. And that was sort of like the process, was finding the book. And it was that structure that really allowed it to come together. I don't know if that answers
Yeah. This book has just a really unique structure in its cohesion. And like you were saying, it doesn't feel like just a pile of poems with a cover on top. The poems really, really speak to one another in a lot of different ways throughout the book.
I have to say, I think part of that is also due to you, because you were the person who came to me and said, this group of poems, they speak to each other. They work together as a unit. And I write a lot, so like my poetry does vary. So it's fairly easy to look at these poems and say, oh, like all your work is so cohesive. But I think that's partly because you have an eye for that kind of thing, and you were able to look at these poems and say, there's something about them that connects.
Thanks. Yeah. And I think, another aspect of your work that I find really interesting is many of your poems, especially poems in this collection, are short, right? The whole poem fits just on one page, but it says quite a bit. And that kind of leads me to another question that I wanted to discuss with you. We're, living in very intense times. There's a lot happening in our world. What does poetry have to offer people in this moment?
Earlier today, I was listening to Eileen Miles talking about her new anthology, and she was talking about what she calls pathetic literature. And she doesn't mean that in like the traditional sense of pathetic. She means like you trip and stumble and break your nose and everybody's laughing at you, pathetic. She means it in the vernacular sense. Mm-hmm. And the idea of poetry being necessary, like not something they would ever defend. And I was thinking about that, and I was like, I think that there's a truth to that in the sense that poetry is a luxury. It's not food, it's not water, it's not something that you can't survive without. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that it's not something that's valuable to anyone who encounters it, that you can't learn from it. It's the places where we can like touch humanity that are the most important right now, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So much of what's going on right now feels like it's an attempt to distance us from community, from selfhood, from humanity in a very real sense. And I think poetry is a place where we sort of ferret away the most human parts of ourselves in a certain sense. I went to graduate school with the poet Nina Riggs, who passed away a few years ago. Before she passed away, she wrote a memoir about dying young and making peace with that. And I think there's something very real about the fact that as writers, we're able to not just have an experience like that, but to have the opportunity to sort of like process it into something that goes beyond our own experience, that's universal.
So I think what I hear you saying is poetry connects us with ourselves, also connects us with each other, connects us with the heart.
Well, I think, poetry is community, right?
Yeah, I definitely ascribe to that as a poet as well. Yeah.
You're here. That's evidence of it,
As you have been kind of introducing this book to the world, to people you know and people you don't know, you've probably gotten the question, what is your book about? What is your answer to that question? That's always a difficult question for poets.
You want an answer, I guess 27 pages. But, but not to be glib about it. I think, first of all, I would say it's poetry. It's about a period of my life. It's in large part about grief. The poems are largely poems that I wrote during a time period after my father had passed away. And at the same time, my partner, she and I were sort of like doing a lot of caretaking for her mother, who was at the time not doing very well and has passed away since. So I think a lot of it was really the impetus for a lot of those poems. They were engaged with that experience and with the related experiences. Like, for example, there's a number of poems that deal with the fact that like I was separated from Melissa because she had to go be a caretaker in another state, and I couldn't travel with her for some reason, or we just decided it was more feasible. There's a poem where it's literally like she pocket dialed me, and I knew it was a pocket dial, but I called her back anyway because I wanted to hear her say hello, and it's a very simple moment, but it's the kind of thing that for me was very resonant in that experience, because like when you're in that place, the people around you are kind of a lifeline,
Mm-hmm. Let's read a couple more poems from the book.
Sounds good.
Yeah. I'll read another pair of poems from the first half and the second half of the book, poems that are directly in conversation with one another.
Okay, so this is called Care for Your Tools. It tore, ripped, shred up, accumulated holes, the seams stretched, disastrous. But what is that coming out from those holes. Something has found a way into this world through what has been torn asunder.
All right, this is the second poem, also called Care for Your Tools. You think the danger is the sharpness of the blade, but ask anyone who uses a knife, a chef, a fisherman, anyone who knows at all will say the dulled edge is the one most likely to cut your hand. So many things we could talk about with these two poems. Go ahead, where do you want to start?
No, I mean, I think that there is something between those poems. There was a tension between them that I think existed even before we put them together, you know, if that makes sense. For me, anyway, as a writer, I can't necessarily say occasionally what it is. I mean, in terms of like where they came from, but I feel like they were both responding to a certain impulse, if that makes sense.
What kind of impulse?
Well, I think that they're both in a strange way about being an artist, and about like trying to be on that line of, on one hand, you kind of have to do things that are a little dangerous with your art. You have to push yourself to that place, but you also have to not go too far either. It's that balancing act, I think. It's very hard to sort of talk about exactly what that means. It's like salting food, right? You know, I've watched these shows where it's like a cooking competition, and some chef will say, well, it's almost too much salt. And it's like, well, no, there's no such thing as almost too much salt. If it's almost too much salt, it's the right amount of salt. It's only when it's too much that it's too much. Almost too much means enough. So, I mean, I think it's that kind of tension where you can't, it's like you don't know you've crossed the line until you've crossed the line. And sometimes when you're doing stuff that's so intimately personal as poetry can be, that's kind of a dangerous kind of thing personally. You have to risk something that's not just, am I going to break this poem, but risk something in the sense of like, am I going to put something in here that's going to hurt me for it to exist?
Ooh, yeah. So there's something that related to what you just said about the stakes, you know, making sure that the poem has high stakes, that it is risking something. You spoke a few minutes ago about the creative process, about how those poems are about being an artist. There's a term that we have in poetry land called ars poetica, and I'm wondering if you would define ars poetica for the audience and talk about the presence of that in this book, if you see it in this book. Well,
I think ars poetica as a term, I mean, I think the first place to start is just that it's Latin for the art of poetry, essentially. And basically it's poetic navel gazing. I mean, not in a bad way, but it's a poem about poetry, right? So it's, I mean, there are a lot of them. There's some very, very funny ones. Billy Collins has that poem Workshop, which I think is a sort of ars poetica. And then there's some very traditional ones where basically the idea is like, it's a poet talking about like, what is it to write poetry? Why am I doing this? Or what is a poem even? And I think that there are certainly places in this book where I'm dealing with writing poetry and with writing in general. I can think of a few poems that almost directly talk about that. I don't think that there's a formal ars poetica in the sense of like, I don't think that there's a poem in here where I'm like, this is the poem about me writing the poem. But I think that that is certainly a theme that I'm wrestling with in the book. That it's the question of not just, these are the experiences I'm having, but also like, how do I get these experiences out and into a form where they're digestible, not just for me, but as poems?
Totally. So you brought up something that we've been talking about the last couple of days, which is something that I love to talk about as a poet with other poets. To you, what is a poem? What makes a poem a poem?
It's one of those things where like once you as a poet start thinking about something like this, you come up with your own cliches that you just keep repeating until people are sick of hearing them. I tend to think that poetry, you know, language is a communicative medium and poetry is an experiential art. I think of a poem as an object, not just a piece of language, but like that's why there are line breaks. That's why it's not just flowing in the way that other language is. It has a shape and a form. For me, I mean, if I were to define poetry, I define it personally as using language to do that which language normally cannot or will not do or communicate. And that, for me, is basically about all those layers of meaning that come from music and from the physical placement of the words on the page and the shape of a poem and all of those elements. I mean, I think for me, I look at a poem on the page before I read it. Like we've talked about looking at books of poetry. Mm-hmm. And I have a tendency, like when I'm reading a book of poetry, at least initially, I won't just sit down and start reading it. I'll just open it up and I'll look through. And at some point, a poem will look tasty. You know, it's like flipping through a menu book and you look and you go, that looks good. Mm-hmm. I'll try that. And, you know, you pull it open and you flip through and you go, the shape of that poem on the page appeals to me. So, I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, you know, is that there's all these little elements that aren't necessarily the obvious thing, but they add to the poem as something other than a bit of information. It makes it into something that you, as the reader, are interacting with and experiencing. You're not reading about someone else's experience. You're having an experience reading something.
Mm-hmm. That's a really nice transition. I have one more question for you before we read some more poetry. Okay. And I'll start by saying one of the things that I really love about this collection is that I find it very accessible. So if you're a person who doesn't read a lot of poetry, it's a great place to start. It has a very sort of accessible on-ramp into it. Or if you're a person who reads a lot of poetry, there's maybe some additional layers and things that you can see in it. And I wonder if you talk about what are your thoughts on, you know, the importance of approachability and accessibility in poetry. How do you think about that?
I think that's a big thing. One thing that comes to mind for me, and especially in terms of accessibility, I think a lot about disability and things. And there's a weird way in which, for me, I try to think about how can I write poems so that anyone can experience them. And that becomes also like, I don't want to rely on a visual image, because if someone's blind, how do they approach that in the same way? And if I talk about sound as the primary thing, so I very often try to talk about experiences in ways that are evocative of sensory feelings, but without being reliant on one sensory modality. I think that's sort of a metaphor for my way of thinking about it in a larger sense, because a lot of what I want to do with my poetry is about metaphor. Tom Lux, who I studied with, said that the only thing you can't teach someone in terms of writing poetry is metaphor. And that sounds very reductive until you think about it in a metaphorical way, because what I think he's talking about really is the sense that poetry takes a specific thing and lines it up in a way that there's sort of like, you know, like when you're looking at things in parallax, lets you line something up, you line it up in such a way that it lines up with something else that makes that personal thing universal, because it's lining up with a structure that everyone can relate to. So if I talk about, like, I was talking earlier about a poem where, you know, I get a pocket dial and I try to call the person back. On one hand, I could talk about that in a way that's very personal and very much about like my relationship with Melissa, and makes it very much like about something very, very specific. But in another way, I can take those specifics and say, okay, like we've all been lonely. How do I make this loneliness connect to whatever loneliness the person reading the poem might have experienced? And how do I make this response to that loneliness feel like something just urgent and human?
Yeah, and I think that connects back to your earlier comments about universality, right?
Yeah.
And that's really one of the things that poetry kind of uniquely offers us.
Can I throw the question back at you for the moment and ask you about your thoughts on that connection, on that sense of, I mean, your poetry also is not inaccessible. You know, as William said, you're not taking poetry back to the university, right?
Yeah, although I do work at a university. But
well, I'm not bad-mouthing.
No. I'm just joking with you. I'm really a strong believer that poetry is for everybody. I mean, that is the work of writing, right? It's a communicative art form. It's about connecting with others. And it's also about getting really, really clear with ourselves about who we are and then offering that to other people.